I'm interested to see whether the extent to which Republicans have learned lessons of the past and decided to really push early voting.
They should.
They have to.
So suddenly, early voting, mail-in voting, not necessarily the boogeyman that it was. They tried demonizing it for a couple election cycles on the right end. How did that work in 2020? And how did that work in the midterms? Not so good. It's kind of nice to be able to vote, to not have to rush out on an individual day where you might be busy, you might be working, there might be bad weather. It's kind of a good thing to give people a little bit of flexibility there. And many on the right had gone along with these attacks against mail-in voting because Donald Trump had done so. And we'll turn to some of the recent reiterating of that. But here's a little bit more of what Fox and Friends had to say about how the right might want to think again about attacking these practices.
A lesson of the last couple cycles is Democrats, largely using COVID emergency measures, know how to bank votes legally. They go at low propensity voters time and time again. And then Republicans count on election day to turn people out, which has a lot more variables for failure. So I'm sure the information's out there. We'll certainly learn in the postmortem.
Okay, so there's a lot there that is fascinating. First of all, it's not new. And it's not just because of COVID. There has been mail voting for decades. There's been early voting for a very, very long time. It's not banking votes, it's people voting. It's a democracy. And I love the relatively recently populist Fox News being like, look at them going for low propensity voting. That's not what democracy is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about us elites who always pay attention to politics and always turn out. How dare you bring new people into the practice? I thought that's what you guys thought Trump was doing, was being a voice for the voiceless conservative majority or whatever. Suddenly, it's a big issue. But I do agree with him. Maybe we should make voting easy to access, not just for Democrats, not just in blue states, but literally everywhere. Make it as easy as possible, and then let the chips fall where they may. Elise, what do you think?
Yeah, we can. The GOP are walking a fine line all the time between what they really think and trying to be populist. And oftentimes the mask will, come off, and they'll realize, and people will realize that, their intentions all along are to ensure that white, rich people are the ones making the decisions in this country. And ultimately, no matter what they say, that is their ultimate goal. And you know that in Georgia with the handful of polling places that are left. You know that with the denial of the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. And even though they're recognizing it now, it's only because they're losing. And so this is the problem with the GOP. And we have to continue to recognize that they're trying to be populist, but ultimately, who are they representing?
Yeah, you're totally right about that being the only reason that they're changing. It's taken multiple cycles for them to sort of get that. They will only support changes, even changes that make 100% common sense when it would benefit them. That's why I know, like if ever demographic changes result in the Electoral College somehow benefiting the Democrats, which it's unlikely to ever do, then finally they'll become allies on wanting to get rid of it. But until then, I kind of doubt it. That said, good luck to the right on changing the base's view on mail-in ballots and early voting, since the guy who inspired so much suspicion of the practice and maybe cost the Republicans the 2 Georgia Senate seats in the last cycle, he doesn't seem to have changed his mind. He relatively recently bleated on Truth Social, remember, you can never have fair and free elections with mail-in ballots. Never, 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 won't and can't happen. If you're listening on the podcast, that was all in caps. I mean, why would you use some caps and some not capitalized? And he apparently liked that point so much that later on that same day, he rebleated it with never. It was a good point in his defense. You can never, ever trust an election that has mail-in ballots, which hasn't bothered him when he has routinely voted by mail himself, as we know that he does. And by the way, he did it in Florida, which allows mail-in and early voting. So I guess Ron DeSantis isn't legitimately reelected to become the governor, since you can never trust the votes if they do mail-in ballots, which they did there. And by the way, I just want to really quickly remind people that there is a big partisan gap on support for these things. Now, this doesn't necessarily translate to propensity to use these practices. You might not like mail-in ballots, but still use it if it's legal. That said, last year in April, Pew looked into a variety of different measures to make voting easier or harder. And there are huge gaps. Like on automatically registering all eligible citizens to vote, Republicans approve that 38%, Democrats 82%. They just want artificial barriers to voting. So when you talk about something like making early in-person voting available for at least 2 weeks, it's 63 to 91 for the Democrats. That's a big gap. And in these close elections where the elections might be determined by 10,000 votes or 70,000 votes at the presidential level, we've seen multiple instances of that over the past few years. A 30-point gap in approval that could lose you elections, and they don't seem to get that. Although to our earlier point about, we were talking about Gen Z, on virtually every single one of these measures, there is a massive difference in how different generations look at these sort of things. So if you look at, for instance, making Election Day a national holiday, we'll bring up this chart. I mean, you can see all 4 of these here. These are different generation cohorts as you go down. It's pretty big, the effect that you can have in support or disapproval for these different measures. No, sorry, if you could advance to the last one, it'll show what I'm talking about there, the different cohorts. But anyway, look, I'm hoping that they do win over the base on this, Elise. I hope that what seems to be a clear preference among younger voters for easier access to voting wins out. I want it to be as simple as possible. I want 100% participation if we can get to it.
I mean, me too. But we're the most energized base that we've seen in a long time, and that is purely because we have been engaged since before we could vote, because we've been so aware of problem and crisis after crisis since we were kids. I mean, I grew up in the school shooting era. I grew up post 9/11. I grew up during, post Iraq, and watching us spend $2 trillion on that instead of maybe nationalized healthcare. We've seen people not be prioritized and instead profit being prioritized for a damn long time. And so that's the reason we want to be involved and have a national holiday and for us to go out and vote. But it's also the reason we're protesting. It's also the reason we're striking and unionizing our workplaces. This is just another metric that shows that we're energized to be involved.
Yeah, no, 100%. And that was clearly visible during the midterms. Hoping here in Georgia, it'll be clear too, that young voters are voting at high rates and also seem to understand what their vote means and vote accordingly.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.